Hello, welcome.
Hello,
Hello, hi Franziska, welcome.
how are you? Wait,
Fine,
let
and
me
you?
change my background. I'm
Oh,
good.
thank you for joining. Now let's wait the people maybe join. I send them also an email. If you want to share the screen, and do you have some slides or?
Yes, I do. Should I do it now or should I wait?
No. You go ahead. Just test now. Now we are not yet live, so
Let me see. Yes, that works.
okay.
Perfect.
Okay, you can share.
Yeah, did you not see it?
No.
Okay, let's try again. Can you see?
Now yes. Now yes. Yes, leave leave like this, and we can go live with this image that is wonderful. So just to advise the people that we are in. Okay, let's start to go live. Now I will start the live session. Okay, here we are. Launching the live stream. Okay. Okay, so welcome this new session of Climate Social Forum. Today we are on the adaptation track, and we have with us Franziska Elmer. Hi, Franziska. So thank you for being here.
Hello, thank you for inviting me.
And as I said in the previous call, we jump in from like a scenario to another, from the fields of agriculture to the sea. And in fact, the title of this talk is If a Tiny Collar Could Build the Coral Reef. So Franziska, I will give you the floor to introduce yourself and go ahead.
Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Franziska Elmer. I'm originally from Switzerland, and I'm a marine biologist and have worked in different reefs, working on mostly coral reefs, but also algae, and often working in the Caribbean. And today I want to tell you a bit about the coral reefs and why they are important for us when we think about climate action. Being a marine biologist is a dream career for me, and it wasn't easy getting there from landlocked Switzerland. During my PhD, I was allowed to go to an island called Palmyra Atoll, which is in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, very far from many human influences, and one of the most pristine places on our planet. Here you can see a few pictures of this place. And of course, I was extremely lucky to spend four times 3 weeks on this island doing research and seeing all these fish and corals and sharks and manta rays. Because this is a place you cannot visit as a tourist very easily. You would have to take a sailboat, which takes 10 days, and only 10 sailboats are allowed to go to this place to keep it pristine. Later on in my career, I also got to go in a deep sea underwater submarine, and I got to go down to 200 meters below the surface of the ocean to see interesting sponges like the one you can see in this picture. But the work as a marine biologist doesn't only have its beautiful sides. It can also be quite sad and difficult to be a marine biologist. When I started diving at an age of 12 in 1998, the reef I learned diving on looked like this. It was impacted by the first mass coral bleaching event, with many of the corals you see here dying after the event. During my master thesis, I went to Florida to look at how human pressures impact the coral reef, from sewage to boating to climate change. And we could see that these pressures had a big influence, especially the sewage one, and that climate change over time will have a big influence as well. And last year, while teaching marine ecology in the Turks and Caicos Islands, we had a new coral disease come to our reefs. The corals you can see here have a white skeleton. This is an area which was covered in coral just a few days before, as after about 7 days the algae will take over. So the disease kills the corals really fast and moves from coral to coral also very fast. So we had a lot of corals infected, and in a year lost 60% of our coral cover. This was devastating. Going diving on these reefs and seeing all these corals which were sick or dying or already dead, broke my heart. And I had many colleagues who were crying on the water because they couldn't bear to see this. The worst was when you saw a coral that you had a personal connection with, one that you particularly liked, or one that I used to show my students a specific species, and you saw that one infected by the disease. Similarly to having a loved one catch COVID. For the longest time, I thought my role as a marine biologist was to do science that helped managers who were looking after these reefs to manage them well. And that the only thing I could do against climate change was to reduce my ecological and carbon footprint. Reducing that footprint was rather hard for me because every opportunity to advance my career normally came with a big carbon tag on it, whether it was flying to a conference or moving halfway across the world away from my family to have a PhD or work on an exciting reef. Even though I was the greenest person in my family, for some of the years as a marine biologist, I had the highest carbon footprint. That didn't make any sense. However, in 2018, 2019, this changed for me. With the IPCC report coming out and Greta Thunberg speaking up, it was clear. 2018 to 2030 will become the most important time in human history. This is the time when we still have it in our hands, whether or not we're going to have a livable planet for us and generations to come, or a planet where it's hard for us and other animals and plants to live on. Knowing that we have to act faster on climate change than we thought we had, and seeing that our global leaders weren't really stepping up to the challenge, I realized maybe my role had to be different. Maybe I had to do more. At the same time, I was reading this book called Be More Pirate from Sam Conniff Allende. In the book, he asks several questions to the reader, which you are supposed to write down your answers to. And the question that impacted me the most was, what principles, values, or ideals are you willing to fight for? And with fighting, he meant risking to lose your job over it, risking your reputation, and risking to lose relationships that are important to you. For me, it was clear the biodiversity and climate crisis were things I was willing to fight for, to figure out solutions. And by writing this down, I realized I could do so much more for to help us solve the climate crisis. I didn't have to be afraid of speaking up, because the things I was afraid of losing, or that I could lose if I did, these were not as important as what I was fighting for or working towards. The book also gave me an idea of who I was going to be in this historic time. After all, you have to have a good character to tell your stories. I decided to be a climate pirate. Living in the Caribbean at that point and having read that book, that just made sense to me. One of my first acts as a climate pirate was to change my lecture in marine ecology. The climate lecture I was giving every semester looked a bit like this. Many graphs showing how different types of animals are affected by climate change. It wasn't one of my favorite lectures and wasn't very engaging to begin with, and I decided to get rid of all the graphs and show my students this instead. A graphic that shows the difference between 1.5 degrees of global warming and 2 degrees of global warming. We were especially interested in the declining coral reefs, which you can see at the bottom corner. If we hit 1.5 degrees, the coral reefs are still hanging on a thread, not doing that well. But if we surpass 2 degrees, then we will lose pretty much all of the coral reefs. So I asked my students, well, we need coral reefs if we want to become coral reef scientists. And I asked them, most of them about 20 years old, who wanted to become a coral reef scientist. A lot of their hands went up. Of course they wanted to do that. That's what they came to the Caribbean to study for. So I told them, okay, let's have a look. How long do we have until we hit 1.5 degrees? And I showed them this climate clock. So we have about 12 years left until we hit 1.5 degrees. Is that enough time for them to build a career, to finish school, maybe even do a PhD? That's not a lot of time. And they were shocked, and it hit home. However, what you don't see here is that this clock shows us the time until 50% of the IPCC models are above 1.5 degrees and 50% are still below 1.5 degrees. So it's a 50-50 chance of staying below 1.5 degrees in this time. A famous saying says, would you put your grandchildren on a plane that has a 50% chance of crashing down? And most people wouldn't do that. So let's have a look at how much time we would have if we want to have a 30% chance of crashing. That time is much shorter. It's about 7 years and a few days. Of course, these climate clocks show the time we have left if we keep going the way we are. If we, however, reduce our emissions, this time will get longer. You can think of it like a bottle of water, which is full in the beginning of the day. If you take smaller sips, the bottle will last you longer. If you take big sips, it will be empty really fast. So the most important thing we have to do to get us time is to reduce emissions and reduce them rather this year than next year and rather this month than next month. Because anytime we reduce our emissions and change the system to something that doesn't use emissions anymore, this clock and the time we get becomes longer. And we really need that. I also realized when I was talking to my students that the best thing I can do for them to have a career as marine biologists studying coral reefs was to not spend 100% of my time teaching them how to study coral reefs and how to be a scientist. I had to take more time to fight the climate crisis and find solutions to make sure that when they're my age, there's still coral reefs there for them to study. So I decided to take a climate change sabbatical. I decided this last year in August, and as I decided it, I got an email from a scientist from Hawaii. She was emailing a listserv with about 5,000 people on the list. She wanted to go to a conference, which is every 4 years, a big coral reef conference. However, that conference is taking part in Germany. And she said from Hawaii, it was too far for her to travel. The CO2 emissions were too big. And she wanted to attend this conference where normally 2,000 to 3,000 people travel from all over the world together remotely. So she could still take part of it in it and advance her career, but don't have to fly there. I agreed with her. It was completely crazy that we, as coral reef scientists, working on this ecosystem that's so impacted by climate change, are still flying around the world to conferences and destroying the coral reef as we do so. However, the organizers of the conference had no alternatives for joining this conference remotely, so we decided to make our own. And this summer, we organized a conference with 150 speakers and 2,700 participants. It was a free conference. It was completely online. And really, we made the impossible possible. Now you think, well, a remote conference, which is completely online, is not impossible. Literally, everybody made this happen in 2020 because we had the pandemic. Yes, you're true. We were a team of 4 people, and we had no prior knowledge to do this and a budget of $1,000, and we pulled it off without a problem. This was not hard at all. However, the impossible part was that for 20 years, coral reef scientists asked to be able to remotely go to a conference, and we were the first team who didn't just ask, but made it happen. So the impossible part was to make it happen, not the actual technical part. And this is the case for so many solutions with climate change. The impossible part is to get people to do it or to start doing it yourself. It's not the technical part or the costs. So today I want to get you motivated to also become a superhero, an everyday superhero, like me and my friends were organizing this conference. And to get you inspired, I want to talk to you a bit more about coral reefs. If you think about the coral reefs, and a coral reef such as the Great Barrier Reef, which you can see here at the bottom, then you may think about how is this coral reef built? How come, who started building this really big structure that you can see from space? Well, the answer is this coral reef is built by tiny, tiny coral polyps, like the one you see above, smaller than somebody's finger. Each of these polyps puts down calcium carbonate onto the reef and slowly, slowly makes the reef grow. The polyps work together in colonies, so there's a bunch of polyps in a coral head or a colony as you know it, and they work all on the same area of the reef and make it their own with their own form and speciality. So this is similar to us being in families or companies or clubs. We have our little part of the reef which we can form, and we can make it a bit our own as well by making different forms. But at the end, every single of these polyps is working on the same goal, and that's how they get this big reef going. So we also have to start working on the same goals. Now, last week, a study was published in the journal Nature, which is a very influential science journal, one of the biggest journals you can publish in. And that study found that every week a human person produces as much human-made materials such as cement, concrete, glass, and plastic, asphalt, as their own body weight or even more. And that in every 20 years, we are doubling the amount of man-made structures on the planet. So really, if we take the coral reef literally, we are even better than those corals at building stuff that you can see from space, because we are building stuff at a much faster rate than the corals are. However, the structure that the coral reef builds, or the corals build, the coral reef, that structure is able to sustain a huge diversity of fish and other animals, and help us humans in many, many ways, such as storm protection and providing us with food and medicine. And also, it is a very productive space, and in itself, it doesn't use many resources. We cannot really say that about our cities and our infrastructure. So really, we should get away from building these infrastructures and working more smartly and more like a coral reef works otherwise. Because what this study also found is that because of us building so much infrastructure and man-made materials, that at the moment there is more mass of man-made materials on the planet than the biomass of all animals and plants combined. And of course, in 20 years, this will be doubled. So by 2040, if we keep on going as we do, we will have double the amount of man-made infrastructure and material than we have biomass on the planet. That's not really a planet we want to be known for. That shouldn't be our legacy. So let's go back to the coral reef to get more inspiration. Here you can see a single coral polyp, and in it you can see some orange looking color. These are tiny, tiny algae living inside the coral called zooxanthellae. These algae photosynthesize during the day and give a lot of their energy to the coral, who then gives waste products back to the zooxanthellae. This symbiosis has of course evolved over millions of years and is a really good example for us how a circular economy could work. There's hardly any waste and hardly any products have to come in from outside to keep those two going and working together and give the coral enough energy to not only live, but produce the calcium carbonate and also reproduce. The other really cool example from coral reefs are the fish and the other things that live on them. I once read a study that said if a fish poops, the poop can go through 5 other fish or other animals before it reaches the ground of the reef. Imagine that. What if we worked like that? If you were about to throw something out, or any human, that it would first be handed down to 5 other people before it actually went into the landfill. If we had a reuse program like that, or a way of living that, then we would have a lot less problems in the world. But also the coral reefs are not always in a good shape. Some of our reefs look like this: overgrown with algae, hardly any corals, and no fish to see. These aren't really productive reefs. They don't have fish for us to eat, and the algae don't put down calcium carbonate, so the function of the reef protecting us from storms is getting lower and lower every day. These algae are taking advantage of having a lot of nutrients, and they are taking over from the corals. And in our societies nowadays, we have a bit of the same problem, that we have a lot of companies and individuals who are only looking out for their own gains and aren't working on a future that works for all of us, and they are taking up a lot of space. So how can you work? What can you do when your coral reef has a lot of algae? There's two ways of getting rid of them. First of all, you have to see where the nutrients are coming from. These algae are there because there's a lot of nutrients on the reef. And if you get rid of the nutrients, then the corals can overgrow the algae again. Getting rid of the nutrients, which for coral reefs is often getting rid of sewage and agricultural runoff, we can be seen in the climate change action as making sure the right people get financing. Let's not finance the algae we have. Let's not finance the fossil fuel companies anymore, but finance the corals, the ones who are working on a renewable planet, such as renewable energies or circular economies or reuse projects. The other thing you can do on your reef is to make sure you have enough herbivores. Herbivores are animals that eat algae or plants, but mostly algae. And one of those herbivores that is really important is the parrotfish you can see here. They will go around and graze the algae so it cannot become abundant. And with it, it makes place for the corals, and even the tiny little corals can outcompete the algae this way. If we think about this in our society, this would be the governments and the regulations that make sure that companies and individuals who are only there for their own gain and are not contributing to our future will not be able to overtake the reef we live in. And these two things are the reasons why I and many others go protesting in the streets. We want less less fossil fuel financing, and we want more regulations from our states and more ambitious goals. So if you want this as well, then please also go to the next protest and speak up for climate change, because it really, really is needed. However, if we are successful and we stop the fossil fuel financing and get the regulations, we end up with a reef without any algae. And then we need the corals. So not only do you need to protest and make sure that there is more regulations and less fossil fuel financing, we also have to make sure that there's many corals growing, or people and companies working on solutions and products that help us in the future and for a livable planet. Because only if we have these corals or these people on our reef, only then can we have a growing coral reef once we get rid of the algae. So please make sure you speak up against the algae, and also start your own little coral group to implement the solutions you find most useful. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Franziska. It has been wonderful, really. Good for the beautiful photo that you showed, and also for the words that you say. Thank you very much. I really say it with warm words. Thank you very much for being here and for sharing your experience and thoughts. So now let's have the chance to maybe ask Franziska some question. If you want to interact now, there is time to interact with Franziska. Let's take this chance, because we are talking with a marine biologist, and regarding my experience, I think that is not so common to do that. So take the chance. You can raise your hand or write in the chat eventually, or open the mic to make the question. So I have one question
Mm-hmm.
to just break the ice. Um, I'm very curious when this metaphor between the algae and the coral reef was born in your mind, because it's I think it's fantastic and very, very impactful. So like a little bit the story of this metaphor that is really fantastic.
Yeah, I think it grew over time for sure, but for 3 years I was teaching marine ecology in for students who were studying abroad in the Caribbean. So they came for a semester to really study on the reef. We spent a lot of time in the water. And while teaching them about the coral reefs and how they're functioning, every time I taught them, I got more excited about how amazing these reefs work. Like the more I study them, the more excited I get about it. And I think it was maybe about 2 years ago when I was like, well, it would be so cool if our cities would function like coral reefs, because like the diversity you have there, the productivity while using very little resources, how to, the different corals, how they are making different shapes, making it possible for so many different animals to live there. If we worked more like that, I think the world would be a better place. So that's kind of how it started, just from being really fascinated on how these corals work.
Thank you very much. It comes a question from Laura in the chat. This talk was about how like a tiny coral reef could build, a tiny coral could build the coral reef. And taking the metaphor, this metaphor, we go into, first of all, the effects of climate change on coral reef, but also something that we can learn from this experience, and how it's important to um, like help more like the tiny corals that are working for a better world, rather than algae that maybe are like storing the ground from other, with the algae can be the fossil fuels. We have another question from the here. Go ahead.
Okay. I'm interested into paleoclimate in the field of coral. So, to Miss Franziska, what do you think about the scientists who interested about the coral data to not to forecast, but yeah, to forecast, but forecast is needed cast too. So, what do you think about the scientists who want to learn about the coral data for the paleoclimate?
For the paleoclimate, I don't do much with the paleoclimate, but I have worked for, like during my master's, the professor I worked with, he was drilling into the coral reef in Florida to get cores of about 1 to 2 meters, and he could tell about 80,000 years back what type of corals were growing there. So that really gave some insights of what was there before. I don't really know how people are forecasting the coral reefs. I think the forecast is mostly, they are dying off if we don't do anything with climate change. And most people are busy forecasting bleaching events, or many projects are restoring coral reefs with more or less success, because often if you restore something before you take away the negative effects that made it go away, it doesn't help either. I don't know if I answered your question, Dor.
Yeah, it's okay. Thank you very much for your answer.
Thank you, Dohir, for also interact. Um, we can take the chance to make more questions eventually. So really, don't be shy.
I think there's a question in the chat from Laura. She's asking where are the coral reefs I was talking about? For the coral reefs, mostly I was just talking generally about coral reefs. So there are any coral reefs on the world, which are all in the tropical and subtropical areas. Personally, I have been to and worked on coral reefs in the Pacific, on Palmyra Atoll in the middle of the Pacific, and also in different places in the Caribbean.
Okay, thanks. We have time for other 2 questions. So feel free to open the mic or eventually write in the chat. In the meanwhile, go ahead.
Yeah. I want to know, I don't know, I'm very confused about the El Nino and La Nina events in Pacific. Could you explain about the coral bleaching? I don't know how coral bleaching and El Nino and La Nina events. I hope that you can understand what I'm talking.
Yes, I understand what you're talking about. So during the El Nino years, so El Nino and La Nina are different kind of like climate systems, short climate systems or weather systems, where if you have the El Nino, you have different areas where there's no upwelling happening, in the coast of South America, for example. So they have less fish there, and then it changes the whole weather pattern, with places having more droughts, other places being wetter, and it affects almost the whole planet for the weather. Not as much Europe, I think. And those that can lag behind. So some places will be affected a year after the beginning of the El Nino is found. And for coral reefs, it has been found that the El Nino years are often the years where we have high high ocean temperatures leading to mass bleaching events. So many of the really hot years for the ocean that were hot where the corals are were also El Nino years. However, as the planet is heating up, we now also have mass bleaching events in non-El Nino years, which is even more concerning.
Thank you. One last question, then we can close. If you have. Okay. If there aren't any other questions, now let's take a break. We will start again at 5. In the meanwhile, just not leave the call now, as I share the link for the next call. The next call will also change the track. Now we are finished with the mitigation track, and we are starting for the other track of today, that will be corruption, eco-crimes, and right of humans and nature. That's very interesting topic. Also is very connected with this last call, because like damaging the human nature is also a crime, an eco-crime, and it stands also in the global rights of next generation to preserve the nature, and also nature have some rights within. We will be with Sara Garcia, and Marco Bertaglia at the beginning. And there are at the beginning 2 calls that you can choose between, one more related on biodiversity and one more related to the rights of nature. I will send in an email to all the participants, but now I will share in the chat the link to the plenary. In the meanwhile, thank you very much to Franziska.
Thank you for the invitation. It was a lot of fun.
It's been fantastic also for us, and really I very appreciated also emotionally for your presentation, and hope to repeat another chance this kind of opportunity. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, just wait 1 second and I'll share with you the link. Okay.